Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Caleb Sampson, and I'm a sophomore and a politics major here at Hillsdale College. It's my honor to be introducing this afternoon's speaker. Charles R. Kesler is the Dangler-Dykma Distinguished Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College, and editor of the Claremont Review of Books. Dr. Kesler received his PhD in government from Harvard University. From 1989 to 2008, he served as director of the Henry Salvatori Center for the Study of Individual Freedom in the Modern World. He has written for numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, Policy Review, and the Claremont Review of Books. He is the editor of the Signet Classic edition of the Federalist Papers, co-editor with William F. Buckley, Jr. of Keeping the Tablets, Modern American Conservative Thought, and author of I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Future of Liberalism, and, most recently, Crisis of the Two Constitutions, The Rise, Decline, and Recovery of American Greatness. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Kesler.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. Wasn't that a fine introduction, I thought, by Caleb? He did a great job. Thank you, Caleb, for that. I see here in the audience many old friends. Wait, that wasn't a joke. Barbara Prestito and Matt Bell, and I think somewhere out there Doug Jeffrey might be lurking, and Tim Caspar even. I was just going to quote a country song, which after all is the source of most modern wisdom. You can't make old friends. You can make new friends, but you can't make old friends, and so it's always wonderful to see so many old friends here and to make new friends as well. Well, I live in California. I've been booed twice already. Where in California we call an event like this a super spreader. Not because you might catch COVID-19, but because you might catch conservatism, which is the only thing more dangerous than the virus. But I couldn't help noticing that you're all bereft of your masks, as am I. When I teach now, I teach in a mask, and the students are all double vaccinated, masked as well, and young. But despite that, it is possible to teach. It's not as good as the real, face-to-face interaction, but it does work. But the experience of being masked put me in mind of the old television show, The Lone Ranger. You remember that? Who is that masked man? That was always the question. That's now the Joe Biden campaign slogan, of course. If you, taking advantage of my position in California, if you go back to the Spanish flu in 1918 in San Francisco, the argument against wide-scale public masking, and there was a big political debate in California, and San Francisco turned down a mask mandate back then. The principal argument against it was that it forced you to breathe your own exhalations. It forced you to inhale your own carbon dioxide. And that seems unhealthy. You know, it lowers the amount of oxygen in your system, although it does have some possible advantages from the point of view of global warming, I suppose. It reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it might help explain the result in California, where our lightheaded voters just returned Governor Gavin Newsom in a recall, which he won by a lopsided 2-to-1 margin. As I like to say, he's not only handsome, he's Newsom. But then again, excessive carbon dioxide might explain many things in American politics, like Joe Biden. Well, I'm not going to talk about Donald Trump, but I do feel a need to mention him, because the phenomenon of Donald Trump has got the deep state rattled. And despite his vices, of which he had a few, he had a lot of virtues, including a very good sense of humor. Who else would have declared proudly after his second impeachment was over, quote, "I am now the most acquitted president in American history." No, he actually said that. He said, "No one even comes close." Well, I've been brought here for the job of talking about two more distant elections than any of our recent ones. The 1932 election, which first brought FDR into power, and the 1980 election, which brought the sainted Ronald Reagan finally to presidential office. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about Reagan than about thank you, than FDR, because I think he's more important to us in our present situation, and more important in thinking about what's wrong with our politics and what can conservatives do to try to improve our politics, to rescue it from the fate that seems to be staring us down. It was the 1932 critical election that really first brought modern progressivism to the controlling heights of political power and authority in the country, most brazenly confirmed in its enmity to what FDR memorably called the horse and buggy Constitution of 1787, and its solicitude for a new regime that progressives have called for more than 100 years, the living Constitution. That is a very ominous phrase, of course. The living Constitution implies what? The other Constitution is dead, or at least it's on life support, and it can only survive by transfusions of meaning and purpose from the living Constitution. But when 1932 first hit, when the election in which FDR won by overwhelming, almost today unimaginable majorities, and brought with him a very solidly Democratic House and Senate, Republicans were in a state of shock, and the few conservatives who called themselves conservative in those days were similarly shocked. They spoke of the revolution of 1932. A few of them even called it the coup d'etat of 1932. So the sense of peril that we feel, the sense that somehow the floor is slipping out from under us, is not a new feeling for conservatives and Republicans. We went through something like this in 1932 and later. And so we might have something to learn from the way they experienced it and what they did in those circumstances. What 1932 was, of course, the Progressive Revolution. Rather than separating and checking governmental powers, liberals sought a way to combine and concentrate them. Needless to say, such accumulated power would be safe only in the hands of selfless experts devoted to the people's good, i.e., liberals. Rather than an embarrassing case of self-delusion fanned by self-interest, they regarded this arrangement as a great ethical advance, because those powers were to be spent in the continual emission of a new class of social and economic rights for the people. These are rights to health care, to a job, to a vacation from the job, to a good education, all these things which FDR explained in his so-called Second Bill of Rights in 1944. But the ideas were circulating from the very beginning of the New Deal. Each new right, if denied, represented the kernel of a social problem. Each social problem demanded a social program to cure it. Every social program constituted a solemn promise in conjunction with all the other programs to bring unprecedented material well-being and unimaginable spiritual fulfillment to the people. You know, to introduce another figure, when LBJ in 1964 was reflecting on the beginnings of the Great Society, he gave you a real idea of what this idealism of these new rights programs was like when he said, "These are the most hopeful days in human history since Christ was born in Bethlehem." In this way, American government, once limited by natural rights and a written constitution, became perpetually engaged in the reconstitution of society itself, of the people. Rather than the government representing us, we came to represent them, our better selves, our rulers. Generally and gradually, a people with the capacity to govern themselves were tempted to become a people addicted to transforming themselves by endless social engineering into whatever the times demanded, down whatever path the living Constitution beckoned. Hope and change became the coin of the realm. And even if hope ultimately faltered, change, which seems to be the situation of today's identity politics, the latest stage of modern liberalism, which I think has abandoned the last shreds of idealism from the 1960s for an endless future of discriminatory payback in the name of anti-racism. But of course, two wrongs don't make a right, no matter how often repeated. Beginning with FDR, the 20th century politically, in a way, falls into two parts, FDR's and Ronald Reagan's. They divide the century between them. These are arguably the only two presidents to preside over a realigning or critical election to change voting behavior in large and enduring ways. Ronald Reagan's breakthrough victory in 1980 and again in 1984 seemed to put an end to the hopes of the revolution of 1932, to turn the page to a different, more conservative country. Yet the relation between these great events in the 30s and the 80s, between these great political figures, remains somewhat elusive. A young Ronald Reagan voted for FDR 4 times and never wholly repudiated him. Reagan, like FDR, was one of the most ambitious men in American politics. Of course, FDR famously ran 4 times for president and was elected every time. This was before the 22nd Amendment was added to the Constitution. But it's less widely known that Reagan ran 4 times for president. 1968, in a last-minute abortive campaign that Richard Nixon won. In 1976, as an outside challenger to Gerald Ford, who had inherited the presidency from Nixon, and then his two winning races in 1980 and 1984. But very few politicians have it in them to pursue the highest office 4 times. That's a remarkable testament, it seems to me, to the sheer political drive and genius of both men. Reagan's argument was really, in some ways at least, an inversion of FDR's. It was the living constitution, Reagan argued, the sprawling, evolving big government produced by modern progressivism that desired to rule Americans. It did so through a new kind of ruling class, a mixture of leaders and experts, whose rule could hardly be resented because it was justified, in theory at least, by the solution of the people's problems, the alleviation of their needs, and the recognition of their lifestyles. By contrast, Reagan and the conservative movement sought to remind Americans that they were not needy victims whose freedom, dignity, and happiness depended on the state, but citizens capable of ruling themselves and capable, therefore, of returning to a smaller, more limited government. Reagan wanted to lead Americans back to the Constitution as it had stood earlier in the century, still more or less in the full vigor of its founding principles. Bear with me, because I'm going to be quoting Reagan fairly often, but then again, he's marvelous. So there's a certain educational joy in doing so. Reagan's starting point, as he built his political career pointing towards 1980, was invariably American exceptionalism. This idea, as he put it in 1964, speaking on behalf of Barry Goldwater, that government was beholden to the people, that it had no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest, most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. 25 years later, in his farewell address, a very important speech not widely enough known by Reagan, he expanded on the point. Quote, "Ours was the first revolution in the history of mankind that truly reversed the course of government, and with 3 little words, we the people. Almost all the world's constitutions are documents in which governments tell the people what their privileges are. Our Constitution is a document in which we the people tell the government what it is allowed to do. We the people are free. This belief," he continued, this is his farewell address, "has been the underlying basis for everything I've tried to do these past 8 years." Reagan spoke of reversing the course of government, that is, returning it to first principles. That's what a revolution means in one of its basic senses, a complete circular turn like the revolution of a planet or of a heavenly body, a return to the beginning. Reagan's 3 little words are, to be sure, a derived truth. We the people are free because each human being who consents to form this people is himself or herself by nature equal and free. That's the Declaration of Independence. That self-evident truth stands opposed to what he called in the Goldwater speech the latter-day perversion, which presumes that our natural, unalienable rights are a dispensation of government divisible by a vote of the majority. Reagan was emphatic that, quote, "we have certain rights which cannot be infringed upon, even if the individual stands outvoted by all of his fellow citizens. Without that recognition, majority rule is nothing more than mob rule." This focus on we the people lent a democratic, small d, or populist tone to Reagan's interpretation, which has been noted but not sufficiently, I think, emphasized. one of my themes here is going to be, in some way, the closeness, in some respects, of Reagan to Trump, and of Reagan's populist impulses to some of Trump's populist impulses, even though neither ever called himself a populist. You know, that's a strange thing about Trump. He never uses this term, which is always used to apply to him. Usually, when a political scientist uses it, authoritarian populist. That's a very technical term. Like the latter-day Tea Party's populism, Reagan's was a populism dedicated ultimately to restoring the Constitution, not supplanting it. But before the people could take significant steps in that direction, Reagan thought they needed first to regain confidence in their own capacity to rule themselves, the right of self-government. American self-confidence had been shaken by the moral and political beating they endured in the long decade of the 1960s, when liberalism's vanguard turned for the first time openly anti-American, very much like today. In 1972, he remarked to the American Legion, quote, "Some of our young people find little to love or defend in this country. There is an increasing tendency to believe the system has failed. It is time for us to quit being apologetic, especially to our own children. Even more important, it is time to challenge some of their most cherished notions by presenting facts about the world as it really is, facts that will expose the sorry myth that ours is a sick, racist, materialistic society." This is, systemic racism, the 1619 Project and so forth. It's not new. This is 1972. Reagan is complaining about the same basic analysis, that the country is fundamentally sick in its soul, that it's, we would say now, systemically racist, systemically sexist, systemically capitalist, and any other sins you might want to think of. This is an old story from the 1960s. Reagan rejected easy talk of the masses, and so of the kind of leadership necessary to deal with the masses. Here is another choice passage from The Speech, his great address on behalf of Barry Goldwater in '64. Another, quote, this is Reagan, articulate spokesman for the welfare state defends liberalism as, quote, meeting the material needs of the masses through the full power of centralized government, unquote. Reagan, I, for one, find it disturbing when a representative refers to the free men and women of this country as the masses. But beyond this, the full power of centralized government was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew you can't control things. You can't control the economy without controlling people. So we have come to a time for choosing. Either we accept the responsibility for our own destiny, or we abandon the American Revolution and confess that an intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them for ourselves. This so-called elite, now this is myself, presumes that Americans must be ruled for their own good because they are incapable of ruling themselves, at least justly. And the elite presumes that the common people must be ruled by a different law than applies to their rulers, for the very reason that the ruling class is so far ahead of the masses. As opposed to the would-be ruling class, Reagan championed the, quote, common sense and common decency of ordinary men and women, working out their own lives in their own way. In my own mind, he often said, I was a citizen representing my fellow citizens against the institution of government. He summed up his premise in a sentence he interpolated into several speeches. I believe in the people. Very simple. This was what President Reagan was getting at in the famous words of his first inaugural, in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. He underlined the point by distinguishing in the same paragraph between two contrary forms of government, implicitly battling it out in American politics. Reagan. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. Well, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? In the struggle between this oligarchy, to borrow the word that Roger Kimball well used earlier today, in the struggle between the oligarchy of leaders and experts ruling a nation of victims and the Republican government of old, Reagan was clearly on the side of government for, by, and of the people, his version of Lincoln. Nonetheless, Reagan's emphatic focus on the quarrel between the people, on the one hand, and the institution of government on the other, tended to overwhelm his own insight that this was also an epic struggle between two different forms of government, between republicanism, self-rule, and oligarchy, rule by an elite, a small elite, between the Constitution, one might say, and the living Constitution. Though he didn't neglect this dimension of the conflict, he sided more and more often and more passionately with the people than with the constitutional form of government they had solemnly chosen. Where one might have expected to find a defense of the Founders' Constitution as amended, an interpretation of its powers and duties, for example, one found instead all too often a sidestep to we the people. Here we arrive, perhaps, at the deepest reason for Reagan's quasi-populist sensibility. He believed in the people, not because he thought a leader or an elite could bring vision and order to their disjointed stirrings, but because he trusted their good principles and their good character, their values. It was not so much their inchoate perception of the future, that's sort of the liberal theory of leadership, but of the past, the living past, from which Reagan-style leadership took its orientation. In a strange way, the people were for Reagan the vital, that is, the living link with the cause of the American founding and with the heroic pursuit of its principles over the years. For him, we the people embodied the cause of American constitutionalism, forming both its substratum and its living expression. This was, you might say, a conservative version of living constitution theory, dispensing with social science experts and progressive leaders in favor of business experts and grassroots leaders who appreciated America's practical genius for freedom. The people and their values formed the kind of living constitution, a living tradition, that Reagan could favor and indeed follow. For him, the American people carried their principles in their hips, to use the formulation of Wilmore Kendall, one of the founders of National Review, Bill Buckley's teacher at Yale. Accepting the nomination in 1980, Reagan said, "My view of government places trust not in one person or one party, but in those values that transcend persons and parties. The trust is where it belongs, in the people. The responsibility to live up to that trust is where it belongs, in their elected leaders." That kind of relationship between the people and their elected leaders is a special kind of compact. Unquote. He restated that compact in his farewell address. "I wasn't a great communicator," he said, "but I communicated great things. And they didn't spring full-blown from my brow. They came from the heart of a great nation, from our experience, our wisdom, and our belief in the principles that have guided us for 2 centuries. He called what his administration had accomplished over the past 8 years, quote, "the great rediscovery," a rediscovery of our values and our common sense. But in the end, this quasi-populist path didn't lead Reagan really where he wanted to go, or at least where he thought the country needed to go. And it came with costs and consequences he hadn't anticipated. To begin with, at some point, the tension between trusting the people's values and honoring the Constitution's principles could and did become problematic. The situation had arisen in the 1960s and earlier, according to Reagan, who in his second inaugural admitted that, quote, "Our system has never failed us, but for a time we failed the system. We ask things of government that government was not equipped to do or to give," unquote. But what options are left to a leader who says, "Trust the people, and I believe in the people," if the people, or a substantial fraction of them, cease to trust or even understand, at least as fully as they once did, their own fundamental values? The term itself pointed to problems ahead. Values, in the sense of the standards or beliefs of a person or group, is not a word that Washington or Lincoln used. It's a newfangled word from social science and philosophy of the late 19th century. Its implications are relativist. Values are no more and no less than the standards which someone happens to value. Where Reagan urged a return to the people's values, the founders, George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, and others, would have called for a recurrence to virtues and fundamental principles. What's the difference? Values are what the people value. Virtues and principles are what they should value. And they should value them because the principles are true, some of them self-evidently so, and the virtues are good, not only for Americans, but perhaps for all human beings as such. Though he never abandoned the argument that Americans had embraced these values because they are true, Reagan was increasingly drawn to the argument that the values are true because Americans had embraced them for a long time and very successfully. If the symbol of the first argument may be said to be the Declaration of Independence and the spirit of the American Revolution, the assertive self-confidence of that event, the symbol of the second in Reagan's mind was the Mayflower Compact. In his speech accepting the Republican nomination in 1980, an important speech, Reagan gave pride of place to the families who in 1620, yes, the year after 1619, dared to cross a mighty ocean to build a future for themselves in a new world. When the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth, Massachusetts, he said, they formed what they called a compact, an agreement among themselves to build a community and abide by its laws. He emphasized this single act, the voluntary binding together of a free people to live under the law, set the pattern for what was to come, a pattern that he then traced to the Declaration of Independence a century and a half later, to Lincoln at Gettysburg, and to his own moment in 1980. Isn't it time once again, he asked, to renew our compact of freedom, to pledge to each other all that is best in our lives, all that gives meaning to them, for the sake of this, our beloved and blessed land? That was an eloquent and urgent question. By taking the Mayflower Compact as his model, however, Reagan seemed to presuppose that Americans were already of one mind about the terms of the community and the goals of the law to which they were being asked to renew their allegiance. Now, the Pilgrims were a small, fervent community of Calvinists, though accompanied by other passengers, grown restive on a voyage that, as you may recall from your high school history, back when high school history had history in it, the Pilgrims intended to land and were supposed to land in Virginia. In fact, the Mayflower Compact speaks of Virginia, but they ended up on Cape Cod, a small error of a few, thousand miles or so. It was And one of the reasons why they had to design a Mayflower Compact is that they weren't in the community they were supposed to be in. They were supposed to be joining Virginians already there. And so they had no authority structure. They had to sort of design what were they going to do when they landed. And shrewd Calvinists that they were, fully conversant with the depravity of human nature, they made sure to everyone signed the Mayflower Compact before they got off the ship. Before the ship actually pulled up to the land, thus avoiding any problems once they had debarked of authority. They were going to be one community, self-governing. But that's one model, where everyone is in agreement, more or less. There may be a little pressure, but everyone is in agreement on what's going to happen, that we're one community, and we know what we're here for. The other examples, the Revolutionary War and the Civil War that he gave in his 1980 acceptance speech, are really quite different. The unanimity came later in the Revolution and in the Civil War, needless to say. The cause of both wars was a deep disagreement about the meaning, you might say, of the Declaration of Independence and its claims about human equality and freedom. Did Reagan in 1980 think that America had a viable political compact already that needed only to be remembered, to be renewed? Or did he think he had to lead and win an argument as part of a political war, a non-shooting political war, in order to reestablish this compact of freedom? This turns out to be, I think, a deep question for Reagan, and that touches the success and the failures of his administration. Years later, he took credit, as I mentioned, for the great rediscovery of our values and our common sense. In that project, the language of values offered two advantages. First, it bridged the differences between the traditionalist and the libertarian wings of modern American conservatism. Reagan's juxtaposition between the people and the institutions of government sounded at once populist and libertarian. His repeated call for a return to traditional American values sounded populist and traditionalist. But the openness of values, the language of values, invited both types of conservatives to see themselves on Reagan's side. Traditionalists got tradition, with religion as an important ingredient, if somewhat vague. And libertarians got values, meaning the freedom to choose lifestyles as well as investments. They both got America, positioned somewhere in the middle. And behind America, the authority of the people, who got to choose what was traditional, what would be valued. Values provided the formula, in short, for the continued coexistence and cooperation of the main conservative factions, but not for a resolution of their differences in the light of what they should value. One could say that values, the language of values, became a kind of secret sauce to be applied to fusionism. It's what made fusionism work. It got the two factions to cooperate without having to agree on a third set of principles that would bind them together. Second, by implication, American values would be defined not so much by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles as by the American people's largely timely reading of history's writ. So Reagan said in 1984, the choices this year are not just between two different personalities or between two different political parties, they are between two different visions of the future, two fundamentally different ways of governing. Their government of pessimism, fear, and limits, and ours of hope, confidence, and growth. Reagan cast the central issue of the election as the choice between hope and fear, optimism and pessimism, the future and the past. The Democrats agreed with this, but reversed it. They thought they represented the future, and the Republicans the past. In any case, he focused his campaigns in 1980 and 1984, and these were epic campaigns which changed the course of American politics in fundamental ways, if temporary. He focused those campaigns on the American people as they recovered their moral and political health. The immediate enemy was the sense of paralysis and drift that had set in under the Carter administration, which paralysis and drift we might today call Biden-esque. For those who have abandoned hope, we'll restore hope, he promised the 1980 Democratic Convention, and we'll welcome them into a great national crusade to make America great again. Yes, that's right. Reagan used the phrase before Trump several times in important speeches, to make America great again. We must act today in order to preserve tomorrow. And we as Americans, he emphasized, have the capacity now, as in the past, to do whatever needs to be done. We need to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to perform great deeds. The citizens of this land, he said, are heroes. His arguments were therefore less about the Constitution and its principles than about the, which you might call the capital C Constitution, and more about the small c Constitution, the health of the American people's own opinions and habits and values. In his 1980 acceptance speech, he called for a new, quote, a new consensus with all those across the land who share a community of values embodied in these words: family, you may remember these, family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom. Justice, moderation, virtue, natural rights, checks and balances were not among these words. Reagan thought all of those things, other things, were valuable, but he felt like they were derivative. They followed from the fundamental health, moral health, and intellectual health of the people. The heroes are our people, not government, he emphasized again and again. But this community of values that he appealed to already existed. That's the strange thing. It didn't need to be created or won. He had appealed to this community before in his run against Gerald Ford and in the important 77 speech to the Conservative Political Action Conference. Here's what he said. This is very revealing. We who are proud to call ourselves conservative, he said, are not a minority of a minority party. We are part of the great majority of Americans of both parties and most of the independents as well. That's his, he believes in a way that this is a Mayflower Compact situation. The great majority of Americans are already on our side. They're already conservative. We don't need to persuade them. We just need to remind them that they are conservative, to activate this latent consensus that's already out there. You can do that in a Mayflower Compact. You can't do that when you're making a revolution or fighting a civil war, because you're trying to build the consensus. You have to make it. It doesn't exist already. You have a political argument which you have to win. You've got to persuade people. Reagan was not convinced that he really had to persuade the American people so much as remind them, reactivate these habits of thought which had grown weary or confused. And thus his diagnosis of the problem in the Carter years was that we suffered from bad leaders. All we needed was good leaders. Good leaders would remind us of who we really are and lead us to rediscover the conservative consensus in America. A large majority of Americans already shared conservative values. It was only the political expression of the values that needed to be activated by the right kind of leadership. Reagan played up this continuity of American values, stretching from the Pilgrims to the present. But to do so, he himself had to speak very abstractly. There was something real but insubstantial about the community of shared values he celebrated: family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom. These are such elementary human goods that almost anyone, and perhaps any but the most oppressive human community, might embrace them. There was nothing peculiarly American about them. And it was hard to reconcile this large consensus with the actual history of conflict in American politics. And now I'll come to my conclusion. Accordingly, what he sought from America in 1980 and 1984 was almost a reaffirmation of values rather than a political revolution. In American history, the decisive political breakthroughs in these so-called critical elections like 1932 involved sharp clashes over the meaning of justice, over the extent of freedom and equality, over the purposes and limits of the Constitution. Reagan never quite asked for that kind of turning point. He asked for a much softer political change, almost an insensible evolution or reawakening of something that was already there. Very different was the way FDR ran in 1932 and in the subsequent elections. In his first presidential race, FDR had attributed the GOP's trickle-down economic theory to, quote, the party of Toryism. And I had hoped that most of the Tories had left this country in 1776. 4 years later, Roosevelt associated Republicans with economic royalists and the privileged princes of new economic dynasties who had created, he said in 36, a new despotism. In later years, he would compare Republicans to fascists. FDR's grand political strategy was to read the Republican Party right out of American politics, to cast it as anti-American and beyond the pale of the Declaration and the Constitution, to pronounce it excommunicate and heretic, and to anathematize its characteristic doctrines. FDR recognized that in 1932, as in 1776 or 1860, the great turning points in American politics involved the reopening of these deep issues concerning the meaning and bounds of Republican government. What ought the values be that will define the American community? He kept calling them shared values, but what exactly did we share? And what are the parameters of that sharing? Reagan entered office calling for a new beginning in our politics. He proclaimed, we come together in a national crusade to make America great again. And now it's all coming together. Greatness lies ahead of us. This was in '84. At the meridian of his tenure in the second inaugural, he elevated his goal to, quote, a second American Revolution. Think of that. That's a very bold goal, a second American Revolution of hope and opportunity. In his farewell address in 1989, he rejoiced that the Reagan Revolution, a term he didn't coin, but one that he accepted, had succeeded in creating millions of jobs and in reviving the national pride he called the new patriotism. Nonetheless, he regretted, in effect, that these worthy achievements had fallen short of the Second American Revolution that he still thought necessary to restore the country's health. We need a patriotism, quote, grounded in thoughtfulness and knowledge, unquote, he pleaded. And then came this passage, this dark paragraph, the one dark cloud in an otherwise sunny, optimistic farewell address, but which in closing I direct your attention to. This is what he said. This is after a fantastic one would say, I think, comparatively, fantastically successful 2 terms. He not only set up the Soviet Union to fall shortly after George H.W. Bush inherited the presidency, but he had launched the economy on a recovery that would last for 2 decades and had restored, as he says, this sense of new patriotism, flag waving everywhere. But then he says, those of us who are over 35 or so years of age grew up in a different America. We were taught very directly what it means to be an American, and we absorbed almost in the air a love of country and an appreciation of its institutions. If you didn't get these things from your family, you got them from the neighborhood. Or you could get a sense of patriotism from school. And if all else failed, you could get a sense of patriotism from the popular culture. But now we're about to enter the 1990s, and some things have changed. Younger parents aren't sure that an unambivalent appreciation of America is the right thing to teach modern children. And as far as those who create the popular culture, well-grounded patriotism is no longer the style. Our spirit is back, but we have not reinstitutionalized it. 4 years after he had hailed the recovery of American values, 5 years after he had won for re-election on the theme, "It's Morning Again in America," he confronted some hard truths. Reagan had grown up in a different America, he admitted. To put that differently, America itself had suffered a change of regime and was a different country now. Despite so many proud accomplishments, which he modestly attributed to the American people, the Reagan Revolution did not become a second American Revolution, which was what was needed by his own admission. In this most comprehensive and important political task, he and his administration had failed, or at least had not succeeded. And the disquieting proof was that even in Reagan's America, an unambivalent, that is, a full-throated patriotism could not prosper, much less dominate. In his retirement, John Adams used to distinguish between the War for Independence and the American Revolution. The latter, the Revolution, actually came first, he said. The American Revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people from 1760 to 1775, as the pamphlets and speeches of the era enlightened them to their rights and the growing union of political sentiment. The war and the great events of what is usually called the Revolution were a consequence of the real revolution that had prepared and forged American patriotism. Reagan's hoped-for political revolution depended on a deeper one, which he and the conservatives of his day were unable to aspire. Being Reagan, he might put the point more optimistically. The great task of refounding American patriotism remained for his successors, for us to accomplish. He had, after all, managed momentarily to thrust back to the center of American politics for the first time since the New Deal, the question of the constitutionality and the justice of the modern state. Was the Constitution still the supreme law of the land, or was it being gradually, almost silently displaced by a new form of autocracy operating behind the facade of the founders' Constitution? A renewal of an ambivalent American patriotism would require renewed faith in the justice and goodness of American principles and institutions. We need this all the more in the age of Black Lives Matter, the 1619 Project, critical race theory, and defacing statues of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and many others. In that sense, the Progressive Revolution has put an end to critical elections. The one-party system established in 1932 endures, even though its immediate partisan expression in a New Deal coalition of a massive, dominant Democratic majority party has long crumbled. But no new national majority or national majority party has taken its place. Instead, since at least since 1968, we've had an alternation between Democrats and liberals, between conservatives and Democrats, alternation between Democrats and conservatives and Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals, and a stalemate overall. We're basically still stuck in the 1960s. The same issues, the same fires of disunion and mutual animosity are still burning in our politics. This stalemate is interrupted only by the dangerous tendency to pass radical programs on very slight legislative margins, like Obamacare, or on the basis of emergency executive powers used in the mask mandates, but in many other, a growing number of areas. That is the political basis of our cold Civil War, the crisis of our two contradictory, competing constitutions pitted against each other. The Constitution that the founders bequeathed us and all of its principles, and the living Constitution of the progressives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kesler. Dr. Kesler will be signing copies of his book, Crisis of the Two Constitutions, in the lobby of the Searle Center directly after the session. We now have time for Q&A. If you have questions, please make your way to a microphone. Student questions are encouraged.
Please, pepper me.
Do you feel that Reagan appreciated the seriousness of the administrative state? And I use that as an example. Right. He pledged, and Bill Bennett pledged to abolish the Department of Education, yet they didn't do it. Did he make enough of an effort? And it seems to me that without reducing that part of our government, you don't get anywhere near what Reagan wanted to happen in this country. And it seemed to me it was a complete failure.
Well, he pledged to abolish two departments, the Department of Education and the Department of Energy. And he succeeded in neither. And in fact, he added another cabinet department, Veterans Affairs, a 13th department. So yes, now look, Reagan was and is a kind of political hero of mine, and I'm sure many people in this room. He faced very uphill odds. He never had a Republican House of Representatives. He had a Republican Senate. He had a court that was ornery and contrary still, and he did not have the kind of a control of the national government that one normally expects in a critical election to be able to call upon. He was therefore in a weak position in many ways. He was able to accomplish, in his defense, I would say he was able to accomplish a great deal from that weak position. But he was not able to accomplish in a way the one thing needful, which was to, precisely as you say, in a way, to delegitimize the administrative state or the modern machinery of government and the modern purposes of government. He never really confronted the new rights revolution. He was also against affirmative action, but he never really took any action against affirmative action or these new rights based on identity, ethnicity, race, gender, and so forth, which were already around in the 80s, but not nearly as virulent as they are now. Yes, so one has, I have a kind of measured or forgiving interpretation of Reagan, I suppose you could say, but from Trump's point of view, Reagan's unfinished revolution could not be finished by Trump either, although he too, at the end of his one term, returned to this theme. The 1776 Commission was all about, a patriotic education again, about reviving an ambivalent sense of love of country. But he turned to that only, it was really, the last gesture of his presidency. The election was over at that point. Too late. Reagan also, in a way, announced it in his farewell address. It needs to be, closer to the top of the agenda than to the bottom, I think, for any president, future president like Reagan or Trump, who wants to make America great again. First, you have to make Americans see American greatness, reacquaint them with what it is to be great and what are the causes of that greatness. It's one thing to appeal to the better angels of our nature, but you have to remind people what our nature is. What are those angels?
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you very much for coming today. My question is, given the current state of our nation, is there hope that we will return to founding principles? And what does an individual do to help perpetuate that change, like an individual like myself? I feel pretty helpless in this situation because we have the media against us. We're shouted down. So
no, it's of course the most urgent question in a way. But I am hopeful. I mean, for a number of reasons. I mean, the actual concrete advice that Reagan gave in his farewell address was that the sort of reaffirmation of American patriotism had to start at the kitchen table. That is, by discussions in the family, by books, sharing books that are sound and truthful about America. And what have we seen since the 1980s? An enormous rise in homeschooling, the charter school movement, and other forms of depoliticizing education by moving it into a non-unionized setting, among other things. So all of that is good, and there are some political signs of hope, I would say, as well. Look, the Republicans did, except for the presidency, and then the loss of the Senate because of the Georgia Senate races. Except for that, Republicans did very well in a very Democratic presidential year, if you believe the figures at least. They took more House seats. They almost got a majority in the House. They were very close, 5 or 6 votes, I think, away from a majority in the House. In California, seats we had lost in Orange County, which used to be a conservative bastion, we won not all of them, but almost all of them back in the election of 2020. And even in, as I said, lightheaded California, where we're breathing our own carbon dioxide, the same very Democratic electorate that voted for Joe Biden by 65% or so, almost 2/3 of the electorate in 2020, also the same mass of voters turned down several Democratic initiatives. For example, there was an initiative to repeal Prop 209 and allow racial discrimination in college admissions, in federal state government contracting, and in several other things. It would have legitimated a full regime of racial preferences of the kind that modern identity politics liberals want. That lost. Same voters. I mean, it lost by a larger margin than it had than the original 209 passed in 2006, I think it was. The original anti-affirmative action initiative passed by about 5%. Its repeal was turned down by more than 11%. I think it may even have been as much as 14. I'd have to go back and look at the figures. But a landslide. Somewhere out there, there are moderate Democrats who are not prepared to follow their leaders into the complete culture war that they're, and a huge business tax turned down by the same voters. I think, there's a lot of evidence that Hispanic Americans are becoming more conservative, or maybe they've always been more conservative. They may, it would be just another strange irony of history if Hispanics in Texas and in the South, and maybe even in California, end up being Republicans, conservative Republicans. So there's nothing inevitable in politics, and so I think you have to be hopeful, and there's some evidence on which to base that hope. Thank you very much.